Hi again. Looking again at Samuel Prideaux Tregelles on Daniel, written in the 1840s and many editions coming up to our day through the 1850s and the early days of Adventism. Tregelles is taking on what he saw as one of the biggest problems with prophetic study, and that's the year-day system. I used to wonder when I started to assemble books on apologetics decades ago when I was still a faithful Jehovah's Witness, I used to wonder why there were so few books on prophecy published today. Not books on future, that is speculation about the last days. There was lots of that around, and Al Lindsay had made a sensation in the 1970s dealing with the signs of the times. But one of the things I worried about was that there was so little material available on prophetic fulfillments, not the future, but what had been fulfilled in the past. And I came across two books that really helped me: John Urquhart, Wonders of Prophecy, and Alexander Keith, Dissertations on Prophecy. But they were published, well, at that point, 70 years in the past, or 130 years in the past in the case of Keith. What had happened? Because I knew in the past the argument from prophecy had been basic to the Christian apologetics, but something had happened apparently in the middle of the 19th century that changed the trend, and prophecy suddenly became uncool. Well, the more I read about it, the more I became convinced of Tregelles was right, and he lived during that very time when Keith was still alive and when Urquhart was born. There were dozens and dozens of books speculating as to when the end would come, and they were built upon the year-day system. That is, the dates 1798, 1828 or 29, 1844, 1874, 1914, 1917 in the case of Grant and Guinness's books. All of it calculated from the year-day system. And virtually all Protestant interpreters in those days were using that year-day system to interpret Daniel and Revelation and Scripture prophecy as a whole. It suddenly fell out of use when, of course, the dates 1844, 1874, 1914, 1917 went by. So that seems to be the explanation of the phenomenon that puzzled me back in those days as to why the year-day system was not being appropriated. Then after that, of course, Grant Jeffrey and a few others resurrected the year-day system when the Y2K was approaching, they thought. Tregelles' analysis then is doubly valuable today because he's dealing with the validity of this system of interpretation, which possessed prophetic interpreters in Protestantism for about 300 years between the Reformation and the middle of the 19th century. Here's his note on the year-day system. I'm going to cover it in several segments. This is the first one. Many have adopted a principle of interpretation with regard to designations of time when they are found in prophecy, to which they have given the name of the year-day system. This principle is that in such prophetic designations of time, the literal meaning must not be held, but that in all expressions of periods of time in future events, a day stands as the representative of a year, and all other spaces of time in similar proportion. There are not a few who hold this as an opinion so established in their minds that they regard it as an undoubted truth, without knowing definitely on what grounds it was adopted. They speak of a prophetic day or a prophetic year as if it were an axiom that these expressions denote the one a literal year and the other a term of 360 literal years. On this principle, they would interpret the designations of time in the book of Daniel and in the Revelation. They thus speak of the 1260 years and the 2300 years. Of course, if we find a distinct scripture warrant for this assumed canon, we must bow to it and interpret accordingly. But if this canon, standard he means, of course, is supposed to be a deduction from Scripture, let us examine whether the inference be legitimate, and let the reception or the rejection depend on the grounds of proof. It is not, I believe, stated by any that this canon is a subject of direct teaching in Scripture. At least none of the points advanced seem to be relied on as showing this. Some of the maintainers of the system expressly repudiate such a thought. For instance, Dr. Or Mr. Conder says, quote, the application of the year-day principle to the prophecy would, a priori, have been incapable of proof, and might seem scarcely compatible with probability. That from a book entitled Literary History of the New Testament. And to this he subjoins the following note, quote, it is admitted that for the first 4 centuries the days mentioned in the prophecies of Daniel and in the Apocalypse were interpreted literally by the fathers of the Church. But from the 5th to the 12th century, a mystical meaning came to be attached to the period of 1260 days, though not the true one. At the close of the 14th century, Walter Brute first suggested the year-day interpretation, which was fully espoused by the Magdeburg Centuriators and applied to the papacy. This is all based, by the way, on Elliott's famous book, Horae Apocalypticae, I think it's called, which is basically a 4-volume commentary, especially on Revelation, but also touching on Daniel and some other prophecies. That the true solution to the enigma should not have occurred to the earlier writers is not surprising. This is still Conder being quoted. It was not intended, and was scarcely possible that it should be shown a priori that such was the principle of interpretation. As Mr. Elliott remarks, while the period was yet distant, a moral purpose was answered by a temporary veil of mystery being thrown over the prophetic period, for the Church was not to know the times and seasons, that she might be kept from the earliest age in the attitude of watchful expectation. It was accordingly not till the time drew near, in other words, till deep into the Middle Ages, that God revealed this new light. Now that's my words, of course. Go back to Conder here. He says, it was accordingly not till the time drew near that the solution of the chronological enigma began to be perceived. Nor does it form any objection to its truth that the a priori evidence scarcely amounts to a probability, when the a posteriori demonstration is all but irresistible. In other words, we couldn't see it in advance, but we see it looking backwards. It seems to be the divine intention that the discovery of the prophetic mystery should wait upon the facts, not anticipate them. End of quote from Conder. Now Tregelles says to this, some who have received the year-day principle without inquiry will be surprised at these admissions of the weakness of the a priori evidence by which it is upheld. Others may think that too much is surrendered. At all events, however, it must be owned that this canon of interpretation is not known as an intuitive truth. The early Church knew of no such axiom, and therefore I hold that it should be shown to be either laid down in Scripture, or else that it should be proved thereby, before anyone can be expected to receive it, and before it is applied to the interpretation of prophetic statements. In the quotation just given, I do not suppose that anything irreverent was intended in saying that a moral purpose was answered by a temporary veil of mystery being thrown over the prophetic period. But surely such ideas and expressions should be avoided. It is by truth that God teaches his people, and thus we can never attribute to him the accomplishment of a moral purpose by that which would be a virtual deception. He may produce a moral effect by leaving us uninformed as to many things, but this is wholly different from such an effect being wrought by positively false conclusions and opinions occupying the mind. Where Scripture is silent, we know nothing as to God's truth, and this silence may accomplish a moral purpose. But where the Scripture speaks to us, how can it be according to God's mind and appointment that a moral purpose should be answered by our thoroughly misunderstanding it, by its being for ages a delusive light? Scripture may mislead the rejectors of truth, but God can never have designed that it should direct his people wrongly. Had he done this, he would have made the reverse of truth profitable to their souls. If it is right that we should now understand the designations of time and prophecy, it was equally right from the earliest period of the gathering of the church. Unless the Scripture taught as a fact that God had drawn such a veil, I would not believe it. And if I thus learned that a veil existed, I would not believe that it had been withdrawn unless I had distinct proof to that effect. To do otherwise would be to assume the existence of some other depository of God's truth beside the treasury of Holy Scripture. Observe, I do not say that Scripture truth on various points may not have been misunderstood, and that for long ages. This is wholly different from maintaining that God laid over his Scripture from the first a veil of mystery. Our hearts are dull of apprehension, so that they constantly need the teaching of the Spirit of God. The Scripture itself is the recorded testimony of that same Spirit. God has taught us in his Word what is our object of hope. He also teaches us of the intermediate scenes as to some of their more important features. A right apprehension of any of the details set before us can never deaden in our minds the moral attitude of watchful expectation. Nay, it is only so far as we are truthfully instructed that we can watch and expect aright. Very plain, then, that Tregelles completely rejects the idea that God veiled the 1260 and the 2300 and all the other day references for what amounts to about 12 or 1300 years before someone figured out that that's the correct interpretation, the year-day theory. And yet, the humbling thought should be that it wasn't just Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Christadelphians that were fooled by this system. They're the ones, by the way, who are still clinging to it. They're the only large groups. Christadelphians are small, but they were among the early participants in this fever of expectation created by the year-day speculation back in the middle of the 19th century. All of the others, including all those Protestant denominations that were clinging to this theory for the entire period from the Reformation until past Napoleon, so well into the middle of the 19th century, until that date, 1844, came along and disappointed so many, and then the subject was dropped, but picked up again by Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses or Russellites. A lot more to be said on this. What are the proof texts that are still used by Jehovah's Witnesses and Adventists, among others, to justify this system? Ezekiel, Numbers are the two principal ones, but also the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9. We'll get into that next time. I'll put in a link to Barber and Russell, among the enthusiasts who picked up the year-day theory when it was broken in the 1870s and 80s, and tell us that this absolutely harmonious system of dates is something you can put your faith in. So I've put a link into that section of our study of the three worlds by Barber and Russell where they make that claim. And by the way, the book The Three Worlds, that is actually Russell's first publication, written primarily, if not exclusively, by Barber, but sponsored by Russell, no doubt. That book, Three Worlds, is about the year-day theory. Everything in it basically is based on the year-day theory. So put faith in the absolutely harmonious dates, and they were assuring us at that point in 1877 that if you did put your faith in those absolutely harmonious dates, you were not trusting men, you were trusting God. See you next time.